Welcome to Cool Talk. In past videos, we discussed Africa, Carthage, Egypt, and several African empires. And now it's time to revisit the continent. Now, on a side note, a lot of African history touches on the rise of a nation or an empire and its fall. But one principal reason is desertification. Desertification is when dry land degrades and becomes a desert. Overexploitation of the land. This occurred in the Sahara, which used to have lush vegetation but deteriorated into a desert that is still growing today. Now, a prime example of this occurrence is Haiti. Back in the 15th century, the French overexploited the land, overexerted it, and the contrast is very evident today. Haiti is very, very dry. We're going to visit many different areas of Africa in different eras. We're going to start by Lake Chad, south of Chad, the Sao civilization, a nation of metal workers and warriors. Now, it would later be swallowed up by the Kotoko kingdom in the 16th century, and the Kotokos would be taken up by the Bornu, or the Karim Bornu, that expanded its empire but overgrazed the land as well. Now, there were divisions, but there was a king. Now, the Bornu called their king a Mai. One Mai named Ali Ghazi ibn Dunama established control of the area and linked the trade routes. In the late 1400s, other Mais modernized the military and began to import firearms from Turkey. Now, this proved to be a curse. Firearms intensified the bloodshed that came with all the rebellions and inner conflict. This brought drought and famine. The Bornu declined until its last Mai was deposed by 1841. In South Sudan, there were the Shilluk people, a nation of farmers and herders. They were taken by the Ottoman Empire and then by the British. Yet the Shilluk are still around us today, led by a chieftain, His Majesty Rethkwango Dak Padiet. In today's Democratic Republic of Congo lived the Luba people. They lived in huts made of reed, made pottery and metalwork, traded, prospered until they were an empire by 1500. And for 300 years they did very well. But then came a Zanzibar man named Tipu Tip. Tipu Tip was born in Zanzibar, and when he went to visit Luba, he was looking for two things: ivory and slaves. Tipu Tip arrived to the Lubas with firearms, with a small army, and it was no contest. He made trading posts, buildings, and had a lucrative ivory and slave trade going, becoming very rich. King Leopold II of Belgium was very impressed by Tipu Tip and made him governor. Then the Belgians took over, got European recognition, and kept the region until 1960, when the Congo declared its independence. Now, it would temporarily be named Zaire. And during the last years, rivalries among the people caused by some groups that wanted to secede brought about the execution of Prime Minister Lumumba. Now, these tensions between the Hutus and the Tutsis and 9 nations in the region brought about 2 wars that caused the deaths of over 5 million people. Let's go back to the 17th century by the Atlantic coast, where lived the Congo, a different group of Congo. Now, they were farmers ruled by a king who was called a Mani-Congo. They traded with the Portuguese. The Mani-Congos increased the slave trade, and the Portuguese helped. When rivals invaded, the Portuguese would intervene. But when the Portuguese established the colony of Angola, this scared the Congo. So the Congo, with help from the Dutch, got the Portuguese out, who later, in turn, got the Dutch out. Back and forth, wars sprang, with the Dutch, the Angolans, the Portuguese, and the Congo. In 1665, in the Battle of Mebuila, Mani-Congo Antonio I was killed and then beheaded. And without a king, without the Mani-Congo, it was chaos. The Portuguese dominated the slave trade, and small kingdoms would surge. In the 1700s, a Congo Christian woman named Doña Beatriz said that she spoke to God, and she questioned the devastating wars that were going on. She said she was a reincarnation of Saint Anthony, and she had a following of thousands. until she was burnt at the stake for heresy. She was 22. In the 1600s, Ethiopia and Somalia controlled the gold trade, and the trade extended over to India, Venice, Portugal, Egypt, and even China. There was a huge exchange of goods and cultures. But when the king of Ethiopia converted to Catholicism, his Islamic followers were offended. There was unrest, thousands of people died, and Jesuit missionaries were expelled. Now, back in the 13th century in South Africa, a new kingdom arose, the Great Zimbabwe. Now, Zimbabwe means stone building, and they were. They also had plenty of gold and grew very, very rich. Royal courts, Chinese dinnerware. They prospered until 1480, when a king from the Mutapa kingdom invaded and split the Zimbabwe. Now, the Portuguese came to Zimbabwe in the 1600s and put a puppet king in place, Mavura. Yet this backfired, since cities that were nearby, fearful of the Portuguese, decided that they would not exploit their own gold mines. They didn't want the Portuguese to know that they had any. In fact, they banned anyone from mining for gold. Now, south of the Limpopo River, several states had rival warfare until one group took over all of them, the Zulus. And by 1818, under its leader, Shaka, the Zulus created a powerful state. Now, Shaka had consolidated the many tribes and built an army. But decades later, the British would make war with the Zulus, break it down into several small kingdoms, and yet there are still between 10 to 12 Zulus in Africa today. They are in the province of KwaZulu-Natal. They're also spread out among the countries of Mozambique and Tanzania. In 1652, the Dutch East India Company posted a settlement called Table Bay. Then they would restock water there and buy meat from the Khoikhoi. They were nomads from the southwest. There was trade, and the Dutch even built a hospital, but the Dutch seized the land, angered the Khoikhoi, and war broke out. There were stalemates, more war, disease, and the Dutch had to bring in slaves from Madagascar. And though the Khoikhoi managed to slow down the Dutch expansion, sadly, they were squeezed out of their own land. This is a Swahili coast. In 1498, the Portuguese arrived to invade and Christianize the region. But the Swahili resisted, and when Arabs came from Oman, the Portuguese left in 1729. Now, if there's one thing that has united the people in that region, it's the Swahili language. It's one of the few languages that people in the Western nations recognize when they think about Africa. Now, in Tanzania, 80% of the people there speak Swahili. And this is John Magufuli, president of Tanzania. Now, Madagascar, right off the coast, was a stopping post for pirates in the 1600s. It grew, and in the 1800s, Christian missionaries had made great strides there. But that was until Queen Ranavalona came into power. She was an isolationist. She built a strong army, repelled the French, and as for the Christians, she tried banning the practice. And when that didn't work, she imprisoned them, tortured them, executed them, and exiled the Jesuit missionaries. She reigned for 33 years. When she passed away, her son took over. He became a Christian, allowed freedom of religion and foreign influence. But his ministers turned on him and he was strangled. Madagascar is very diverse. It's managed to keep its customs and at the same time modernize. And thanks to these guys right over here, for the Western nations, it's kept the name of Madagascar alive. The Songhai people had expanded their regions and created an empire, but they were invaded by Morocco, who was after their gold. Now, the Moroccans broke the Songhai into small states before they left. Their golden dreams didn't materialize. But then migrants came called the Fulani people. They arrived and launched a war. They later established an empire that encompasses North Nigeria, Cameroon, and Benin. Later on, the British took over. Now, there are about 40 million people in West Africa who descended from the Fulani people today. Very diverse people stretched out over a large region. West Africa, Central Africa, parts of the Sudan, parts of the Red Sea coast. There are 14,400,000 Fulani people in Nigeria alone. Most are nomads, some of them are farmers. They are very diverse, bound together, however, by custom and the Fula language. It's the largest ethnic group in West Africa today. The Kingdom of Dahomey had two major trades going on: slaves that were going out and firearms that were coming in. Now, King Agadja was successful in his reforms to centralize and stabilize the region, but he was unsuccessful in trying to stop the slave trade. The Oye Empire took over Dahomey in 1740 and forced the Kingdom of Dahomey to pay tribute. And now we must talk about the transatlantic slave trade. It was begun by the Portuguese. The first official slave ship to cross the Atlantic took its voyage in 1526 and landed in Brazil. Now, many African slaves stayed in Africa under West African nations or under foreigners with increasing amounts of property there. But as for the Atlantic slave trade, it started with West Africans selling captured Africans to the Europeans. The Europeans were the Portuguese, the British, the French, the Spanish, and the Dutch. The slaves were considered property, as were their children. Many Europeans began to cut out the middleman and raid villages themselves, capturing slaves there. The slaves were used in the tobacco fields as well as the cotton fields. Later on, sugar, cocoa, and for 400 years, this practice continued. Now, historians differ on the amount of slaves that crossed the Atlantic, but 12 million seems to be the correct number, and that's probably conservative, not including another 2 million who didn't survive the crossing. That's 14 million people crossing the Atlantic in total. This averages out to 35,000 people kidnapped and enslaved every year, or 95 slaves taken every day for 400 years. And these numbers do not include the slaves that remained in Africa. Now, at the same time, there was colonization, and by 1898, the Europeans had conquered and divided up most of Africa. Disease took many of the European lives, but with the invention of quinine, they persisted. It was the age of famous explorers such as Richard Francis Burton, Samuel Baker, and David Livingstone, who would trek across Africa, explore, and report their findings. Ironically, by the 19th century, the Europeans tried to ban the slave trade. You see, they didn't want African slaves anymore. They actually wanted Africa. France, Belgium, Portugal, Italy, Germany, and Spain, and the United Kingdom snatched the land and created new borders. Now, this lasted until after World War II. By 1951, decolonization had started with the Libyan independence, and it peaked in 1960 when 17 African nations declared their independence. It has not been smooth. There were civil wars, clan rivalries, and border wars. There was also the Rwandan tribal warfare between the Hutus and the Tutsis that resulted in a civil war that took the lives of between 500,000 to 1 million people in 1994 in 3 months. Muammar Gaddafi took over Libya in 1989. He was assassinated in 2011. Idi Amin Dada was president of Uganda between 1971 until he was ousted in 1979. He was known as the Butcher. Between 100 to 500,000 people died under his regime. Gamal Nasser became president of the newly independent Egypt in 1952. Now, Egypt had several wars with Israel until the Camp David Accords were signed in 1979. Segregation and apartheid laws in South Africa lasted from 1948 to 1994. This was a year that nationalist Nelson Mandela was released from prison after serving 27 years. He later became president of South Africa. Civil wars had broken out all over in the 20th century, including Liberia, Sierra Leone, Nigeria, and the Ivory Coast. Now, even though Asia is the leading continent with number of deaths by starvation, Africa still has a long history of hunger and famines. Desertification, overpopulation, political instability, civil wars, and refugee migration has caused this. In sub-Saharan Africa, 3.2 million children under the age of 5 die of hunger each year. That is 6 children every minute. The deadly disease of Ebola seems to have concentrated in Africa. Efforts are being taken to eradicate the disease. Of the over 39 million people in the world today that have HIV or AIDS, 25 million of them are in Africa. Now, steps are being taken to raise awareness and prevention. There's even a Sesame Street character in Africa, and it's a Muppet called Cammy. So, the 20th century has not been kind to Africa. Hopefully, in the 21st century, education and technology will reverse that trend. And now, for my next video, we're going to be visiting Australia, and with a little special attention to the Aborigines. But in the meantime, thanks for watching. Comment below, or better yet, subscribe. This is Cool Talk.